Hi everyone, this is Ezekiel Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be talking about what happened in April 2021 in paleontology. So let's get started. To start, we're going to look at some of the biggest news with one of the most famous dinosaurs that is known, Tyrannosaurus rex. And this first paper actually doesn't deal with Tyrannosaurus rex directly, instead it deals with a close relative, Pterosaur. Known from the Kaiparowitz Formation of Utah, a new quarry was found containing multiple specimens of the genus, and they may have actually been living in a family group. This is suggested by the fact that some of them are relatively young, potentially as young as 4 years old, while at least one specimen is a fully mature adult, at least over 20 years of age. This may suggest that, again, these kind of family groups would have hung out together and they may have exhibited some level of gregariousness, and potentially even hunted in packs, although that's going to be a lot harder to prove very distinctly. Another paper more directly on Tyrannosaurus rex tried to find out how many there were over time, and so this would have been on a yearly basis, but also just throughout the entire time this species existed. What they suggest is that there were about 127,000 different generations of Tyrannosaurus rex, with about 20,000 alive at any one time. This would have led to about 2.5 billion Tyrannosaurus rex having ever existed at any time throughout all of history. This means we would have only found about 1 in every 80 million Tyrannosaurus rex that ever lived, at least according to this paper. And it is important to look at how the paper got to the numbers that they did, because there's a lot of variability in some of these values. For example, on the range, the low end of the estimate is 1.42 million kilometers squared, whereas the high end of this estimate is 3.18 million square kilometers. So there's a lot of variability in that, just based on that one factor that is going into this larger equation they're using. So there's still going to be a lot of variability, and I wouldn't use any of these numbers as very, very distinct and hard numbers. We probably would expect something that's a little bit different, especially since a lot of these numbers and the equation used was based off of modern predators in the modern day. But Tyrannosaurus rex lived in a slightly different environment, essentially. The most notable thing is there weren't a lot of mesopredators around when Tyrannosaurus rex was around. Mesopredators being essentially smaller predators that aren't as dominant. So something like coyotes in North America compared to gray wolves being the apex predators. But Tyrannosaurus rex, again, didn't live in this kind of environment. Instead of having multiple mesopredators in the environment, it seems like the juvenile Tyrannosaurus essentially filled in those roles. What this means is the kinds of equations that we're using for modern day ecosystems may not be as applicable to the late Cretaceous of North America, simply because it's such a different environment and ecosystem than we see today. There was also a paper trying to understand how Tyrannosaurus rex would have changed throughout time as an animal age, using trackways from the Wapiti Formation. The Wapiti Formation shows a trackway with very similar depth between the different footprints that are in it, although the footprints of these tyrannosaurs are entirely different sizes. What it helps to show is that, based on these very similar conditions of the deposition of these footprints, that as tyrannosaurs were very young, they had very bird-like, very gracile feet. But then as the animal got larger, it essentially grew out of that, and essentially developed more padded muscles around the bones rather than having them be more shrink-wrapped. And this would have helped the animal be able to support its weight more effectively, especially as it got into multiple tons of weight that it needed to support. Also in dinosaur trackways, there was a teeny tiny stegosaur track found, and it actually helps to suggest that stegosaurs may have also been living in groups, although these would be herds rather than packs. This is because the very small baby track, something that would have probably been about cat size of a stegosaur, was actually found alongside the tracks of much larger stegosaurs, meaning that, again, this may have been a family group or essentially a herd moving from place to place. So there's a lot of behaviors that we can start trying to understand based just on footprints. Another dinosaur which may have lived in groups is Diplodocus, one of the sauropods. However, this paper didn't actually look at whether or not it would have been living in groups. Instead, it looked at preserved skin impressions that were found in the Morrison Formation. What the fossil shows is a couple of different types of scales. Some of them have never been shown in any kind of diplodocid, including some of the more ovoid and oval-shaped scales, as well as some more rounded and dome-shaped scales. There's even scales that actually seem to line up very similarly to what some alligators have today, where essentially it helps the animal flex and move around with the skin stretching there so that it can actually move its legs. So it looks like this kind of scale setup may actually be ancestral in the archosaurs, with it being present now in both the dinosaurs and the crocodilians. So potentially for future reconstructions of dinosaurs, we can try and expect this same kind of scale pattern to be developed on those animals as well. As for the sauropods, a review of Triassic dinosaurs of South America found that early sauropods and prosauropods are among the most common early dinosaurs found, with very few theropods actually being known at all and very few ornithskins being known. Part of that is because they essentially developed a new phylogeny using this study, and it needs to be more worked on by other researchers and just more confirmed. However, it does suggest that the Herrerasaurids, which were thought to be theropods or very close to theropods, may not actually be theropods, instead being essentially their own clade separate from the other theropod and carnivorous dinosaurs. It also finds that the Herrerasaurs did survive the Carnian, a stage during the Triassic in which there was massive amounts of climate change going on. However, the surviving Herrerasaurs aren't actually found in South America, instead being represented by North American taxon, such as Chindesaurus and Tawa. This means that early in the development of dinosaurs, there really weren't a lot of theropods, even though we had thought they were, and we had thought they were doing relatively successfully, at least towards the beginning. Essentially, the first now more confirmed theropod is going to be an animal like Coelophysis, as opposed to Herrerasaurus. And as for the Ornithischians, this paper still struggles to identify what the dinosaur or dinosauriform Pisanosaurus was, as it seems like it may have been Ornithischian, but it's not entirely clear, especially since this paper also doesn't find the Silosaurs, which previously had been considered dinosaurs and not considered dinosaurs by different studies. It also recovers those as not dinosaurs, although closely related to the dinosaurs. What this means is essentially there's still a lot of work to be done on the phylogeny of early dinosaurs, and while it may just seem like the early development of dinosaurs is just a few simple branching steps, that's really not the case. Additionally, there was another South American sauropod found, although this one comes from the Cretaceous, and actually from Chile, making it only their third dinosaur ever found. Named Aracar linanante, it was a titanosaurian sauropod, and shared some similar features with some of the Indian and also Madagascan sauropods. What this helps us suggest is that Chile was actually somewhat separated from the rest of South America, even during the Cretaceous. We can say this because there was still a lot of diversification happening in the Argentine sauropods especially, and this means that then the coastal environments of Chile, when Aracar lived, were under the same evolutionary pressures and environmental stresses that the more inland sauropods would have been facing. And so they were able to essentially stay more steady in their evolution, rather than going through the same kind of diversification events we see in these other sauropods. Another Cretaceous dinosaur, this time the hadrosaur Yamatosaurus izanagii, a very basal hadrosaur coming from Japan. What this helps to show is that there were very late surviving early hadrosaurs that weren't in some of the more famous groups of hadrosaurs, such as the Saurolophines or the Lambeosaurines. Because it was a very late-lasting member of these basal hadrosaurs, it helps us suggest that potentially these other groups also evolved in a similar area. And so essentially, this basal hadrosaur evolved concurrently and equally with these other groups of hadrosaurs. And so it wasn't outcompeted by them because they weren't introduced to there through migration, making a sudden shift and change in the environment. Meanwhile, once the Lambeosaurines and the Saurolophines migrated into North America, we do see the loss of a lot of these early hadrosaurs and iguanodontians, essentially because there's a whole new herbivore group there that's causing entirely different pressures than what the animals were already adapted for. And on the topic of their migration, there was an additional new hadrosaur named. This time it is actually a Saurolophine, and has been named Ornatops incantatus, and comes from the Menifee Formation of New Mexico. It seems most similar to animals like Brachylophosaurus and Probrachylophosaurus, meaning it probably didn't have a crest, but instead just an expanded nasal region. And we do actually see parts of that in the skull that is preserved, although it isn't preserved incredibly well. This does mean, though, that we can hopefully start piecing together how the Saurolophines were able to migrate into North America and how they spread once they got here, because they did eventually become some of the most dominant animals on most of the North American continents, especially as they were herbivores that were very common, especially when you look at things like the Hell Creek Formation, where Edmontosaurus is wildly common and the most dominant herbivore of the environment. But these animals all went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, likely because a giant rock from space hit the planet at thousands of kilometers an hour. There was a new study, though, that looked at essentially how the recovery from that would have taken place, at least in southern continents. This paper looked at different pollen and leaf samples to essentially look at how quickly the turnover and recovery happened, but also what that recovery looked like. Because during the Mesozoic, forest and especially rainforests didn't really look like what we have today. Instead, they were dominated more by plants like pine trees and conifers, rather than the modern trees we have now, which are fruiting trees, angiosperms. What the study found is that in the 6 million years after the impact, the recovery had reached biodiversity levels that were seen before the impact. However, the entire ecosystem had shifted more over to these angiosperm plants, which means essentially that after the impact, we have the first rainforest that we would recognize as being very similar to what we have today, as opposed to the more bizarre cypress-dominated rainforests of the Mesozoic. After this extinction, there was also the diversification of the mammals, although the marsupials didn't diversify nearly as much as the placental mammals did. And a large part of that comes from essentially their reproductive strategy. A new paper looked at essentially the necessary requirements for marsupials to be able to continue breeding. And part of it is because they are born so small and need to essentially crawl to the teat so that they can feed on the mother's milk. They have to have already fairly developed jaw structures. Essentially what this means is that when they're born, their jaws aren't going to change significantly from that. So there's not a lot of opportunity for them to start diversifying their jaw shape because it needs to be locked in when the animal comes out. So there's not as much opportunity there to just diversify to the same degree that the placental mammals have. And one way that marsupials were never able to diversify is they could never diversify into the oceans because they have such very strict breeding requirements. However, some groups of other mammals did, including the sirenians, which include dugongs, manatees, and the now extinct Steller's sea cow. It only went extinct in the 1700s. However, there's new evidence based on DNA which suggests that it was probably already on its way out. This likely happened about 4,000 years ago, when sea levels rose. This essentially would have cut off a lot of different populations from individual habitats, as essentially they don't dive very deep. So the raise in sea levels would essentially just create large open spaces of water where they couldn't do anything. This isolated the populations and caused them to already be undergoing significant stress, as they weren't able to maintain healthy populations. But then again, during the 1700s, hunting by humans did eventually finish them off. And continuing with the DNA idea, there's something called eDNA, which is environmental DNA. Essentially, in the modern day, you can take soil samples or water samples and separate out different strands of DNA and ID what animals are living in the area, even if you don't see them directly. This has now been done for 14,000-year-old cave sediments in Mexico, and has shown two different types of bears who are using this cave. The first is a black bear, and it actually seems very ancestral to the eastern North American population of black bears, rather than the east and western population of black bears being more directly related to one another. The other bear, though, was Archosaurus simus, or the short-faced bear, which had incredibly long limbs and was absolutely massive. Because some of its fossils have actually been found in permafrost in the very northern reaches of North America and Siberia, we're actually able to compare this southern population's DNA to that northern population. What the study found is that these two populations of Archosaurus simus are actually pretty distinct, and depending on which species definition you use and essentially how isolated they are, you might be able to consider them different species. Although we're not going to generally have DNA, so that may not be the most reasonable assessment to make right now. Although hopefully more eDNA will be used in the future, and we can be better suited to try and address some of these questions. There was also a full sequence of the genome of one species of Smilodon, and this was actually compared with the genome of another very large saber-toothed cat, Homotherium. What the paper found is they're actually very distinct from one another and spent a lot of time evolving entirely separately. This means that it's going to be hard to try and identify, based solely on the fossil record, when and where cats first showed up, because they went through a lot of diversification very, very rapidly, rather than what we had thought with the saber-toothed cats showing up later. Instead, there's two different distinct lineages of saber-toothed cats showing up early, plus all of the modern lineages that we have today. And while we're talking about Homotherium, it's really interesting to mention some of the isotope research that's been done on their teeth, as well as some of the other features that they found on them. And that's because the different features we do find, including isotope data, suggest that Homotherium was actually feeding on baby mammoths. And this is different than what we actually see in Smilodon, which seem to prefer a more forested environment and would have been hunting things more like deer and tapir. Meanwhile, again, Homotherium would have been more out on the plains hunting baby mammoths, but also some other more open grazers, such as horses. This paper actually has a video abstract that goes into more detail on what the researchers did, so you can find that link down below and you should be able to access that abstract. And then you can get a better idea of what exactly these researchers were looking at that caused them to come to this conclusion. And while the saber-toothed cats are extinct now, we do know some places that they lived about 40,000 years ago. And one of those is very neat in particular, and that's because it shows an entire population of different mammals that would have been living in Mexico 40,000 years ago. The genera found include Camelops, Equus, Lynx, Canis, and Smilodon. However, only 3 of these live here now, although technically one of them isn't the same genus, it's just a close relative, being the Javelina. This means that we can see distinct changes between the population and community that lived there 40,000 years ago versus today. And essentially a lot of that population changed from mostly herbivorous to mostly omnivorous or carnivorous. This means we can track some of the population changes that occurred from place 40,000 years ago versus today. And what we're able to find is that essentially it's most likely that a lot of this shift happened from a more herbivorous community to a more carnivorous community because of climate change. As once the temperature started to warm, this environment would have been far less able to support plant life, meaning animals like equus or horses would not have been able to survive here as efficiently. And with them, a lot of the large predators like Smilodon would have also left. This would then leave some of the very small predators that could hunt on smaller prey, such as Canis, specifically the coyote. And as for other recent population and community changes, we're able to look at a now extinct crocodilian from Madagascar. Often called the horned crocodile, it's named Voya robustus, and 13,000-year-old DNA recovered from one of its fossils has been able to help illuminate essentially how they separated out from the other crocodilians, showing that they separated about 27 million years ago and are most closely related to true crocodiles, the genus Crocodylus. Based solely on morphology, though, it was thought they were most closely related to Africa's dwarf crocodilians in the genus Osteolaemus. This helps to show the importance that DNA is having in understanding the fossil record and the history of different groups as they evolved over time. And still in crocodilians, but this time going back to the Cretaceous, a lot of people think of crocodilians, especially old crocodilians that lived with the dinosaurs, as being massive animals like Deinosuchus. And that's not always the case. For example, there was a new species named Scolomastax sahlsteini, which was only about 1 meter to 2 meters long, and so is a far cry from the giant crocodilians you think of as having lived with the dinosaurs. And it's important to remember that the crocodilians and the dinosaurs were very closely related to each other, and that's where this next paper comes in. And that's because it looked at the evolution of the ears in both of these groups, and it found that they were actually different shapes, specifically in birds and in crocodilians. In particular, it found that birds had much more rounded and larger ear canals, which essentially helps the animal know where it is in a 3D space. It was thought that these large and rounded ear canals evolved specifically so that the birds would be able to achieve flight more effectively. And this paper actually contradicts that. Despite the crocodilians having much more flattened ear canals, neither of these is essentially an ancestral condition. The common ancestor of both of these groups would have had very differently shaped ear canals from either of them. And this means that the crocodilians don't essentially preserve a very primitive condition. Instead, they're just as derived as the birds. And as for the cause of this kind of evolution, we can actually look at the pterosaurs for some better understanding. Because while the pterosaurs do have much more rounded ear canals, they aren't necessarily large, which means the birds probably didn't evolve their ear canals solely for flight. Instead, it's more likely that the ear canals that evolved in all of these different groups evolved more based on what the skull needed to do for the animal to be successful. And then essentially the ear canals would fit that later. So for example, in the crocodilians, they have very flattened tops to their ear canals. And that's because they have flat heads, because they generally lay in the water and they want that flat profile so that they disturb less of the surface when they come up for air. So this paper really helps to show how sampling in a very large clade can help us understand the different evolutionary pathways that occurred that cause different features to evolve in different groups. And as for the birds, we're going to look at a group called the Stegosaurs, which are often called night birds and include animals that are like nighthawks and nightjars and hunt at night, but also other birds, such as swifts and even hummingbirds, which hunt during the day or feed on nectar during the day. What this paper found is that there are some major differences in the ontogeny of these specific groups. For example, in many of the nightjars, they have wide mouths so that they can help catch bugs while in flight. And this is more similar to the condition of young birds. Essentially, it's paedomorphic in that it comes from young animals keeping their young traits longer. However, this evolves separately in multiple different lineages of the night birds. Additionally, it does show that the hummingbirds are somewhat of an outlier, but that's expected as they're not necessarily exactly the same as the other night birds in the group Stegosaurs. But it does help to show that there can be multiple pathways that do reach essentially the same conclusion. And that's something we need to understand better for evolutionary biology so we can understand what we should expect in the fossil record and how different species do speciate from one another. There was also a group of pterosaurs that were probably fairly similar to some of the night birds, specifically nighthawks and nightjars, and that's the Inureognathans, of which a new species was named. Sinomacrops bondei was a small Inureognathan that resembled a lot of the other ones, although this paper also did a phylogeny on them and found them to be sister taxon to both the pterodactyloids and the Darwinopterids. And the Darwinopterids are particularly relevant because there was a new species of those found also coming from China, named Kungpengopterus antipolicatus. This is the first known pterosaur that essentially had an opposable thumb, which is a very exciting adaptation that we didn't necessarily expect to see in the fossil record. There's also another species of Kungpengopterus, which doesn't actually show this kind of opposable thumb, although it may have had it, and essentially the identification of it could come down to just chance and how the animal is preserved. I actually go into a lot more detail about this animal in another video that I've already done, so if you want more on that, you can actually check out the video that'll be down in the description below. And while on the subject of some of these different evolutionary changes that are happening between very similar groups, we can actually look at hippos and whales, because they are actually very closely related, as I do get into in my Indo-Hyas video, which if you haven't checked out, you can check that video out as well. Despite the similarities between hippos and whales though, their skin is set up differently. And what makes this even more interesting is a genetic study was able to identify 8 skin genes that are present in both whales and dolphins that are entirely shut off. And the mechanisms that essentially shut off these genes are entirely different in both of these groups, meaning that they essentially both evolved to lose these genes because they were spending more time in the water, but they lost them in different ways and still had their skin set up differently despite spending so much time in the water. So a lot of the similar processes can come to similar answers, but they won't necessarily always be the same when you're looking at evolutionary pressures and how an animal adapts to it. And as for other water-loving animals, we have the ammonites, which as time progressed became more and more complex, specifically when looking at their internal structures. The internal structures or sutures on the ammonites have been up for contention for a long time. Because these sutures become more complex over time, it was argued that they essentially evolved this way to deal with higher and higher pressures. But even a living relative, the nautilus, can actually still survive at very deep pressures despite not having these sutures. But instead, a new study has been able to suggest that they may have actually helped with buoyancy. And that's because essentially the different curves and levels of this would have retained water and moisture. And a special type of film that exists in the modern day cephalopods would have probably also been present in the ammonites and could be expanded and contracted at will with that water in order to help essentially control how dense the animal is overall. And if it increased that density, it could sink faster and in a more controlled way. Whereas if it lowered its density, it could rise up to the surface in a more controlled way. So it seems like there was a specific adaptation present for these sutures that likely had to do with the animal's movement and ability in the water. And as for the overall water ability, we're going to look at other tetrapods that live in the water and return to the water actually. And that includes things like sea snakes, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and whales. What the researchers found is that there's essentially 5 steps from an animal moving from land to the water, and that later in these steps, as an animal essentially crosses the threshold from step 3 to step 4 and becomes more aquatic, after that point, the group will diversify wildly. But before that point, an individual group will not have much diversity. However, there are more groups overall occupying those first 3 steps of essentially just occasionally feeding from the water or taking advantage of marine resources. What this means is essentially there's ecospace to be had at the shorelines. However, if your group is going to actually diversify, it really needs to make that plunge into the water. And if it doesn't do that, there's a good chance it's not going to diversify very much and is more at risk of going extinct. One of these groups that returned to the water were the mosasaurs, and there's research done on their isotopes which helps suggest that they would at least return to fresh water reasonably often, probably in a bi-weekly kind of phase. Essentially, they probably needed to get rid of excess salt that they'd accumulated from swimming in the oceans, and so they'd swim up to stream beds or into streams in order to help get fresh water to help flush out some of that excess salt. This is something we see in some of their closest relatives, the sea snakes, as they do a very similar thing, although they potentially were even worse at getting rid of salt, as it seems like sea snakes do it more often. As for the mosasaurs and the snakes, they actually belong to the larger group Scolomastax, which is essentially lizards, so they're just very specialized lizards. A new paper, though, looked at a Cretaceous lizard coming from Mexico, and found that it could probably run on its back legs. Essentially, it could run bipedally. However, this paper also looked at some other lizards, which also could have run bipedally in the fossil record. And a lot of these animals aren't very closely related to one another, which helps us suggest that having long back legs and short front legs, and potentially even running bipedally, is the ancestral condition of all lizards. And that's essentially what they would have been doing when they first evolved. This also means that early on in their evolution, there were probably a lot of lizards that were running bipedally, as opposed to just a few species that do that today. But the origin of the lizards isn't actually in the Cretaceous. Instead, it's actually in the Triassic, about 240 million years ago. And during this time period, another group of reptiles was having its own origin story, and that's the turtles. The origin of turtles has been up for a lot of debate, with some people finding them very close to modern reptiles, and other people finding them essentially based on morphology rather than genetics, as entirely separate from modern reptiles, and closer to a group called the Pterosaurs, which were very large herbivores which lived during the Permian period. One early turtle fossil is often ignored in a lot of research trying to answer this question, and that's because it wasn't fully described. But now it has been fully described. Chilean was found in the Chinle Formation of New Mexico, and it helps to show, based on morphology, that the turtles probably are Pterosaurs, rather than being closer to modern reptiles. It also suggests that another animal that was thought to be an early turtle or early turtle relative, Pterosaur, probably isn't. Instead, the authors suggest that Pterosaur is more closely related to the sauropterygians, animals like the plesiosaurs and some of their relatives. There still needs to be more research done on this topic. However, like Chinle, some of the evidence for it might just be in museum collections, meaning that there needs to be authors who are willing to go into museum collections, find specimens that were found potentially decades ago, and re-describe them so that we can make sure we're getting all of the relevant information that we need to understand the origin of some of these groups. As for the diversification of turtles and the lizards, a lot of the ecospace that opened up that allowed them to diversify happened because of the mass extinction at the end of the Permian. The Karoo Basin of South Africa, though, helps to provide one of the best windows into this time period, because essentially there's a continuous series of deposition from before and after the extinction, meaning that by looking at different fossils that occurred very near that boundary, researchers were able to understand what exactly was happening to population dynamics as the extinction approached. The first finding is that the extinction on land took a lot longer than the extinction in the marine settings, which happened very rapidly. Instead, on land, it took at least 1 million years for the extinction to fully reach its full effects. However, they also found that Lystrosaurus was actually building in numbers before the extinction, meaning that it wasn't necessarily the same kind of thing that we were expecting, where Lystrosaurus squeaked on by and then diversified in the Triassic. Instead, it seems like they were already building on those very rough conditions that were killing off all of the other animals in its environment. And as for the cause of this extinction, there was a massive increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And a new study suggests that that couldn't have just come from the Siberian traps. Essentially, they found a 6-fold increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that would have been in the atmosphere. And while the Siberian traps were a massive set of volcanoes which did release a lot of carbon dioxide, there was probably another source of CO2 and carbon in the atmosphere during the Permian-Triassic extinction. One hypothesis for this has been essentially the degassing and melting of frozen methane deep in the oceans. And what could have potentially happened is essentially the volcanoes erupting could have changed the climate and destabilized it enough that then the melting and degassing of those frozen methane deposits could have occurred. And this would have released both methane, which does burn into CO2 and break down into CO2, but also it would have released some CO2 that was already present in those deposits. But whatever the case, this massive increase in CO2, as well as other gases, did cause this extinction. And so we should be aware of modern-day pollution with CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and just making sure we understand what the relations are between global warming and mass extinctions and our own current-day environments. And part of understanding how environments change means we may need to get down to some of the cellular level on some fossils, which cellular fossils may not be as rare as we previously thought. A study looked at multiple different occurrences of cellular fossils, which we have in the fossil record, and found that there aren't an incredibly rare number of them. Well, certainly they are rarer than just your average fossil. Things like amber do preserve cellular structures on occasion, and the proteins famously found in Tyrannosaurus rex do actually show some of the cellular structure. And while the cells definitely are not the original cells, they've been replaced by other materials, it does help us to understand how the cells were built, potentially what evolutionary pressures the animals were going under at a cellular level, which essentially opens a whole new field of science into paleontology, as we can potentially start bringing cellular biologists into the field. And as for cellular features, there's also older cellular features, including some that are over 1 billion years old. This is actually the first fossil we know of a differentiated multicellular organism. While there are some multicellular organisms which are around the same age, those kinds of algae fossils that we find essentially have all one type of cell. They're all just photosynthesizing cells living together as a group. This is the first fossil which has 2 distinct styles of cells. This means that different specializations were occurring, meaning the organism was getting more complex, and we could potentially place it into one of our modern groups which also has complex multicellularity, such as plants, fungi, or even animals. Unfortunately, though, because of how it's preserved and the fact that it is still very small and not very complex, even though it does have these more complex cells, that means it's really hard to try and narrow down which one of these groups it actually does belong to. But hopefully we can find more fossils like this in the fossil record and try and come to a better understanding of how exactly multicellularity did evolve. And still in the Precambrian, we're going to be looking at one of the most famous Precambrian fossils, Dickinsonia. And that's because there's been some traces that have been attributed to it, specifically feeding traces, but also potentially moving traces. Dickinsonia, though, could also adhere itself to its substrate relatively well, and this has been used to suggest that it was potentially adapted to living in very shallow waters, as essentially the movement would help it avoid the tides, so it wouldn't be above the surface and dry out. However, a lot of the wave action could be damaging to an animal, and being able to adhere to the surface when needed would also help to protect it. These kinds of adaptations are things that we do see in tidal zones even today, where animals do need to protect themselves from drying out in the sun, but also need to be able to protect themselves from wave action so that they don't injure themselves physically. So there's a lot of understanding that can be had even in very, very ancient fossils by just comparing them to modern day animals. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. As I mentioned, be sure to check out the video on Kungpengopterus antipolicatus. And we're probably going to end up doing a lot more of those where we're doing smaller videos on things as they come out. That's something we're going to work on as we're kind of, finding how we want to try and organize the channel. Don't forget there's still a chance to join the Patreon and vote for our next What the Hell Is This video. A lot of interesting stuff happened in April. May's looking interesting as well. We'll be here posting stuff. With that in mind, everyone, be safe, take care, wear a mask, and don't go extinct.